So as we jump into this, our first point on this, Janie, next slide, just click over to that one, because I changed a judgmental attitude hinders relationships. You might say, well, yeah, that's, as my kids would sometimes tell me, or I would tell other people, like, no, duh, of course, right? A judgmental attitude hinders relationships. I had originally written down a judgmental attitude hinders our calling, and that does as well. And we're going to jump right into this. And again, our idea is what Jesus is saying. There's the surface, and then there's a lot of depth. And these different, what the seminary term pericopes, these different pieces of the story that Jesus is saying, each one is a sermon in itself. But we're not going to do that to you because we'll never get out of the Sermon on the Mount. So we're going to take some snippets, but we're going to dive down in a little bit. So the first one in chapter 7, Judging Others, is the title in my Bible. It says, do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. There's a whole lot that Jesus just said right there. And sure, you can read that and said, don't judge. And it's really simple. There's so many times I can take a circumstance or a situation and make an instant snap judgment. I remember walking downtown as a young guy in Chicago and coming from a little town of Morton, Illinois, where I grew up, just 2 hours north of here. Kind of an affluent town. You never saw vagrants or beggars on the streets and things like this. They kind of weren't allowed in the town, right? And so going up to visit in Chicago and walking downtown, you had all these people dressed in rags and all this, and what would they do? They'd come up and want a little bit of money or something like this. And as a young person, for seeing that, I'm judging them immediately. Oh, you're a drug addict, or you're this. You're just going to take the money and go buy alcohol or all this. And I looked at them at a little bit of disgust. Like, why would you do this to yourself? And of course, you just ignore them and you would walk on. And it wasn't until I was older and a little more mature, and I understand the different circumstances that happen in people's lives that maybe get them into those situations by choice, by so many different things that go on in the world. But what Jesus is saying here is, do not judge, or you too will be judged. And I looked up the word judge, and I looked it up in some of the Greek, and it's a verb, it's an action, it's not a noun, it's an action. Do not judge. And actually the Greek word is krino. Not that that means anything to anybody, but as you look and you research that word, it means to judge judicially, or to condemn, or to discern. And what he's saying is, he's not saying do not judge. Do not make an assessment of what's going on in and around you in people's lives. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying, in fact, go to the next slide, Janie. What he's saying is, we do not judge to condemnation. I see this situation, and I've made up my mind. This is what it is. This is who you are. This is what the circumstance is. And I have judged to condemnation. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is you judge for identification to restoration. Meaning, another way to put it is, I put down, love people enough that when I see them erring, I will lovingly confront them. Does that make sense? In other words, I have talked to people, and one even last week, and I said, listen, I don't think you're making a right decision in this situation. Is it easy to go up and to confront somebody like this? But I am genuinely concerned about the situation and the decision the individual was making that's going to affect family and other situations. And I went to him and I said, listen, I don't think the decision you're making is a good one. Well, Breck, that's your opinion. You don't understand everything that I'm going through with this. No, but I understand what the scriptures say into this situation. And I explained it to him. But I did it out of love, and I got a little bit of hostility back in the beginning, but I just said, listen, I'm not here to judge you in this. I'm just here to say, listen, here's some things that are probably going to happen because of the decisions that you're making. And there's all these examples around us. And we had a really good talk. In the end, he said, thank you, everything else. I have no idea if it changed his mind. I'm usually a skeptic. I don't think it did any good. And I thought, oh my goodness, and I went on. And I'm praying for the situation with that individual. But to judge, what Jesus is telling them is to love people enough that when they see them erring, to lovingly confront them. So a quote I wrote down in my notes here is, because I care about you, I want you to know that you're going in the wrong direction. Some people can be very appreciative of it. Others don't want to hear those words. But Jesus actually speaks into that as well. But it does tell us in Galatians 6, verse 1, it tells us, brethren, if a man is overtaken in a fault, ye, which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. These are the teaching that Jesus is saying. In other words, you can go out in love, not in anger, not in frustration, and you can actually confront them. But he's also giving this as some more in his words to kind of quantify what he's saying. So he goes in the next example. He goes, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Now, I don't know about you, but there's times I think, why do I even want to bother? Because, man, I know I'm not perfect. I know I have problems in situations going on in my life. But he uses an example here. He uses a speck of sawdust. Go to the next slide, Janie. He uses a speck of sawdust and a plank. Why would he say a speck of sawdust? Again, we had our granddaughter over in the middle of the night, or after she's in bed, she was kind of squirming around and things like this. I finally got up and I said, what's going on? She said, well, I think I have an eyelash in my eye. My eye's really bothering me. And I looked, I couldn't find anything, and she goes, well, she is allergic, we found out, to our dogs and stuff, so I actually ended up giving her a little bit of Benadryl or something just to help with that. And her eyes were irritating, gave her a warm rag to put over her eyes, and then she fell asleep pretty immediately after that. But the speck of sawdust, here's something that's unique about these two things. You can go next slide, Janie. They're the same material. They're just different quantities. A speck of sawdust and a plank. They're both wood, right? Made out of wood. What is Jesus telling them? One aspect, when you think about it, it's the same sin. You see things a lot of times in our weakness and in our failings in our own life, we are hypersensitive to others in the same situation. And we can acknowledge it and we can see it because it's something that we've struggled with. And sometimes it's our own frustration in our own lives that we become very hypersensitive to the other thing and we jump down their throat, saying, you need to fix this, when we know that we have the same problem. And we can really become judgmental, angry, and condemn that person. And there's a great example of this in the Bible. If you remember when David sinned with Bathsheba, if you know that story, another man's wife. He took her as his own, right? Nathan confronts him. The prophet comes up to the king out of love, confronts him and said there was a man who had this sheep and loved this one sheep, treated it like a pet, fed it, slept with it, all these things. The sheep meant so much to him. But there was a very wealthy man who had some friends come over who had cattle and sheep and everything else. But instead of taking one of his own, he went and took that other man's sheep and killed it and fed it to his friends. And David became incensed, so angry, he said, you need to find that man, and we are going to make him pay, and we're going to actually prosecute him and put him to death for what he did, and we're going to restore it all to this other man. David was furious. And what did Nathan say? You are that man. You took another man's wife as your own, when you had all these other wives and all these things. It's a prime example of what we can do in our own life. Jesus says, do not judge. But he even takes it a step further. And he says, do not give to dogs what is sacred. Do not throw pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under your feet and turn and tear you to pieces. I thought, Lord, what does that have to do with judging others? Why would you jump all of a sudden to dogs and pigs, talking to the Jews who said those are unclean, they were something you never associated with. In fact, you didn't even touch them, right? And Jesus says, you don't give what is sacred to dogs and pigs. But he's talking about judging and talking about condemning and everything else. And next slide, Janie. What he's bringing out the example is, are they open or sensitive to what you're saying, or are you just arguing and debating? What am I talking about? When you go to an individual who's maybe in erring and going wrong, and you want to confront them, are they open or sensitive to what you're saying? Or do you end up just debating and arguing and nothing good comes from it? This is a really, really tough situation to be in. There are people who come and confront or do things just to get a reaction, just to get whatever, and then what they want to do, they want to argue and debate. I find this a lot on even on college campuses and things like this. Different evangelists will go in, and some of these students will come up and they'll make these statements, and then the evangelists will come back and they'll argue, and it gets in this huge debate back and forth. It's like, who can win the debate? Now, yes, they are being what God has called them to, and they're being an apologist, right? Who's proving the word of God and everything else. They're not shrinking back, but it usually becomes into this huge debate and argument. And Christ says, don't throw your pearls and your treasures to the pigs and the dogs. And usually I remember my uncle had a hog farm, and I remember he'd go out and they'd slop them and he'd feed them, and they'd just throw all this whatever down, and the pigs would eat half the food to get thrown on the ground, and they're stomping it down and all this other stuff. It was just kind of disgusting, right? But that's the nature of the pig, and they would eat all that stuff. And that's what Jesus is saying. Don't do that. And my uncle had a missed part of the back of his calf, and he always kind of walked a little bit of a limp. And I remember asking him one time, what happened? And he says, you never turn your back on a sow. And he goes, because they'll bite you. I said, what do you mean? They're feeding. It's just the nature. And that's what happened to him as a young man. One of the big sows had given birth, and he had thrown them feed, and he had turned to go get another scoop, and the sow had lunged and bit and took out a chunk of flesh and meat out of the back of his leg. And I said, what did you do? He goes, well, I had a big seed scoop in my hand. I turned around and I hit that sow on the top of that head, and as hard as I could, and it just went flat. I said, wow. And he goes, well, that really scared me, because that sow was worth thousands of dollars, and I thought I'd killed it, but he just knocked it out. And he goes, and I got to the doctor, and they had to go through a bunch of series of shots. Also, it's just a side story, so it does happen. So the question is when you're talking and you are confronting out of love, are they open or sensitive to what you're saying, or are you just arguing and debating? If you're like me, times I want to be respected, I want people to hear me, I will immediately go from really wanting to help to the debate. I'm the dad. Respect what I'm saying, do what I'm saying, whatever. I just want my will done, or the situation, or you're being foolish with what you're doing, and this is why. You should take my word for it. All that stuff you can go on. But here's a question. How about you? Are you more concerned about being right than you are truly helping? Sometimes we're our own biggest hindrance. And I understand family situations, circumstances, relationships are difficult. But Jesus is saying, don't judge, or you're going to be judged with the same way you're judging. And it's usually what the reaction is. People will come back, well, you're saying that, but you do this. And I'll confess this, there's been a few times my wife and I have had some arguments. I'll say arguments. And she'll throw this out, and it really cuts pretty deep sometimes. Oh, and you're a pastor, and you're acting like this. And I usually respond like, yeah, I'm right. That's why you need to hear me. But it doesn't go anywhere. We're just mad. So anyway, I think that point's well enough, because there's point 2. We need to be diligent in our spiritual walk with Jesus. We need to be diligent. So what does Jesus say here? He immediately goes into ask, seek, and knock. Verse 7, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, the door will be opened. Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. That's pretty easy to understand. Ask, seek, knock, and God will answer. On the surface. But if we drill down and we go a little bit deeper, the one thing you have to remember when you read Scripture is we have to read it in context. So what is it that's going on? Jesus had talked about in the Sermon on the Mount a number of topics. Next slide, Jeannie. He talks about being salt and light. He talks about anger and murder, right? He talks about lust and adultery. He talks about divorce and oaths and vengeance, loving our enemies, generosity, being giving. He talks about prayer and fasting, building our treasures in heaven, worry, being anxious, and now judging others. And immediately he goes, ask, seek, knock. So many times we think, Lord, what do I need to do in this situation? I'm going to ask you. I'm going to seek your will, and I'm not going to quit until you give it to me. But in context, Jesus is bringing us up. How in the world can I do these things? How can I be salt and light? How can I control my anger to the point where God says, even if you think wrong of that person, it's like committing murder in your heart, lust, adultery, all these things. How can I do these things? Jesus says, ask me, seek me, and knock. But he's not just saying it as to these people. These are all verbs. So really what he's saying is when you ask, keep asking. Keep seeking, keep knocking. Not just one time, but repeatedly. But I am struggling with this anger in my life and my anger in the situation, in the circumstance. I've confronted them, trying to do it lovingly, but it always turns into an argument. Ask me for wisdom. Ask me for guidance. Keep knocking and watch how I provide in these situations. But why do I have to keep asking, seeking, and knocking? Why can't I just pray and God answer me? And this is a difficult question, really, to think about. And I don't have just a simple answer to that question, but it's a big question. And the one thing I learned in reading some different commentaries and things like this is, why do we have to keep asking, keep seeking, and keep knocking? And one point I came up with is God is cultivating a relationship of trust and communication skill that's needed for our Christian walk. God is doing more than just the situation that he has allowed into our life that maybe is a little bit of long suffering that we are facing right now. He's allowing some of these things to work in our communication, in our walk with God. And I'll give you a really lame example. Back to that bucket I bought at Home Depot and bought the wrong stuff. Working on an old building in Greenville, I had a leak in a roof. And first I just kind of ignored it because I thought, well, ice dam I had up there, it's because the ice backed up and I got it cleaned up, and it shouldn't really happen again because it wasn't happening earlier, now it is. And in that last rain, I went upstairs in the building after I had insulated and drywalled the ceiling because I was being optimistic, right? Like it's just going to go away. And it was leaking everywhere to the point where it leaked through onto the floor, through the new drywall on the floor, into the floor below. And I thought, oh my goodness. And I thought, okay, I got to fix this. And I'm like, Lord, you just help me. I mean, I don't want to put a whole new roof on this building. I don't want to. I went up on the roof and it was dirty and all this ice and some snows on there. I couldn't find anything. I thought, man, I'm going to have to call a roofing guy. That night I was laying in bed thinking about that situation, and I didn't sleep well because I thought, oh, okay, I could maybe do this to fix it. I can do here. Now I have to prop up the whole roof because it had sagged a little bit. All these thoughts are going through my mind, and the situation from a leak had gone into like, now it's a whole new roof and it's everything else, and structural and all that. And so the next morning I got up early, went and got the ladder and climbed up on the roof and swept and cleaned it all off. You know what I found? There was one little hole. It's about the size of a quarter, so I wouldn't say it's a little bit of a low spot on the roof. I thought, what in the world? And I realized when we did the work below, we pushed some things around and leveled some stuff up, and it was an old nail that had poked through. And when I was scraping some of the ice dam off, trying to be really careful, I took that little nail pop and I had not seen it, and I actually made it bigger, made the problem worse when I was up there trying to find it. And I couldn't see it because the roof was dirty until I cleaned it all off and everything. And I thought, what in the world? And you know what I had to do to fix it? I pulled the nail and I went and got some sealer for $15 and I sealed it all up and cleaned it up. Why would God take me through all of that? Because I tell you what, I laid there in bed. I lost sleep over the situation and everything else until I finally decided, Lord, I've been reading about asking, seeking, knocking. I'm asking for your help. I don't know what to do. And I want to just open my eyes, let me see. This is just a roof, right? This is nothing of any super serious nature. And I got up there, and you know what I found it? I thought, man, $15. I didn't even have to spend that much. That's what the whole tube of sealer cost me. I only used a small part of it. And it's fixed. I'm like, Lord, forgive me for not coming to you first and trusting you in these circumstances. And that's a kind of a lame example. I get it. But even in other situations, so many times we get so worked up when really if we would just pause, pray, use discernment, and continually, and let God move and work. Because here's what he's promised us. For everyone who asks, receives. The one who seeks, finds. And the one who knocks, the door will be opened. So many times we think God has it in for us because I've messed up here and he's not going to answer certain things certain ways. He's not going to answer certain things certain ways. He's going to answer them his way. But we serve a God of love. We serve a God as a giver of good gifts. He serves a God of joy, of peace. All of these things. But yet we don't go to him first because he says, which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? When your kids come to you, those who have kids or nieces or nephews, when they come and there's a genuine need, what do? You do everything you can to help in that genuine need that's good for them. You're going to want to be the one that's going to want to bless them. You're going to be the one that wants to be there for them. Whether it's just a high five or a gift of some kind, you do it. And I'll tell you what, if one of my grandsons or kids come to me with a genuine need, I'm like, oh yeah, you need a piece of bread, you're hungry. Well, here's a rock, suck on this, right? Now my grandson, I've probably done that to him a couple of times just to tease him. But he'll have bread, probably more than bread, right? How much more your Father in heaven gives good gifts to those who ask him. And then he drops a bombshell, which is the golden rule. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. What he just did is he summed up almost the entire Sermon on the Mount. Really, for sure, verses in chapter 7, 1 through 11, he summed up, but probably the entire Sermon on the Mount. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. If I am really walking down a wrong path and I'm going to go into some self-harm or something's going to be a bad situation, I would love someone to come up out of love and try to correct me and warn me. I may not like it, but that's what a true friend or a true person does. That's what we do. We help each other, and sometimes helping each other, we have to call each other out. I have a good friend of mine that I talk to pretty frequently, and there's times he's called me out, and I've called him names. Oh yeah, right, and it's just because, but you know what? We have that great relationship because it's give and take. I've done the same thing for him, and those friends are kind of rare to have. And there's times I don't like him very much because I know he's speaking truth. And I'm sure there's times he doesn't like me, I can't imagine, but he does. So the question is this: how about you? Do you see God answering prayers in your life? I gave one of a stupid example of a roof and a hole in a roof, right? And I understand there's much more serious situations going on. But if we won't recognize God moving in the little things in our lives, how are we ever going to recognize him when he moves in the big things in our lives? God says, if you ask, I will answer. If you seek, you will find. And if you knock, I'm going to open the door. It may not be 100% the way we want it to work out, but I guarantee you this, it will work out better than if we worked out our own situation. But he goes on. Point 3, God guides and provides for his children. How do we know this? In verse 13 and 14, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow is the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Breck, how do you get God guides and directs? Well, there could be a whole sermon on these two verses, but I looked up some things. Narrow gate. And I remember this from seminary studying this, and it was Cyrus the Great, his tomb. Cyrus the Great was the one who established the Persian Empire. He was a king, and when he started, Persia was just this little nothing of a country. And in his 30 years of reign, he was a conqueror. And he defeated major armies, and he grew the Persian Empire, but he did it in such a way that he was also pretty benevolent, that he built an empire that didn't die with him. In other words, he established governments and control of people in a way to help people, and he was a very honorable man in what he did, and the people loved him. And in a battle, he was severely wounded, and he ended up passing away from that wound in that war. I forget all the details of that, but when they buried him in his tomb, he was so beloved and so well admired that they guarded his tomb for almost 300 years. Isn't that something? But what's his tomb, this narrow gate? When Cyrus had his tomb built before he passed away, it was done with these huge stones, and there's no mortar. It's really an architectural marvel, because it's also designed the way they did it, that even when earthquakes come, the building can shift and move, but not. That's why it's still standing today. But what he did is there's only one gate, one door into this tomb. And it's very short and small. It's only like roughly 4 feet tall and very narrow. So to come in through that narrow gate, now the people would have understood this. To come through that gate, you had to stoop very low. You couldn't have all this armor and all this stuff on. You really much had to take everything off other than your base clothes, and you would stoop and bend over and work your way in. Why? Because you're bowing to a king. But when you got in there, there was a golden sarcophagus, if I'm saying that right, with golden legs. There was, and it said something like carpet or something on the floor in there originally, and there was precious jewels and everything. It was a prize worthy of a king. But you enter through the narrow gate, and what is on the other side? Treasures that are untold. Isn't that something? That was his tomb. A guy who followed Cyrus years later was Alexander the Great. We've all heard about him. Alexander the Great studied Cyrus, and he followed a lot of his tactics and things like this, and he so admired Cyrus that when he conquered Persia, right, he went to the tomb out of respect, and it was still established and to honor Cyrus and all that stuff. And what happened during all the chaos and the turnover after Alexander the Great left, the tomb was raided and a lot of those treasures and things taken and stuff. It just so happens that Alexander the Great came back to the tomb and saw that it had been raided and was so furious that he found the guards who were guarding the tomb and had them arrested and tortured and demanded that the tomb be completely restored to original condition. That's what he did. And it's just a side story. But the problem is Alexander the Great, his empire didn't last. It fell apart right after he passed away. And because he didn't build with him and the people and the stuff to continue it. Plus, it was all prophesied in Scripture, Cyrus as well as Alexander the Great. And we went through that when we did the book of Revelation. So it's really God is in control. But God guides and provides for his children the narrow gate and the broad road. There's a great book written that really describes this. It's called Pilgrim's Progress. I don't know if you've ever read the book. I read it here not that long ago again, and it's a great story about a struggle with a man and a burden on his back, and there's all these opportunities he has to step off of the narrow road and to enjoy other things. And it's all this temptation and all this stuff, but he stays. If you haven't read Pilgrim's Progress ever, or if you haven't read it recently, I would suggest maybe rereading it. It's a great analogy story, and it's a lot about the narrow road. As you look up not only the narrow gate, but the broad road, a broad road really means this. It's a spacious road. Rome built these huge roads that still are there today. Or it also means like a large room. But a narrow road actually means this when you look it up. It's a path that is difficult to follow, but leads to a positive outcome. So again, why narrow? Why would God say, just come to me and there's this beautiful pasture? And you just walk up this really simple road and it's just gorgeous, really easy life. Why narrow? 3 reasons I came up with. One, it's God's protection. It stops us from wandering off the path. Remember that story about 1 degree off in a sailing ship. They'll never hit their port. Never even come close because they're just 1 degree off on a path. So God does it for our protection. It's also his proclamation to us. I'll come back to that one in a second. And it's God's provision. How do we know this? Because when we come to John 14, verse 5, it says this. Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way? Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Philip said, Lord, show us the Father, and it'll be enough for us. Jesus answered, don't you know me, Philip, even after I have been among you for such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing this work. Believe me when I say I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least believe me on the evidence of the work themselves. Very truly, I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father. And I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. You may ask me for anything in my name, and I will do it. Those are the words of Jesus. Why the narrow gate? Because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And it leads to blessing. So the final question today is, how about you? Do you ever grow weary of your road? I don't know about you, but there's times I do. And God says, that's okay. Because when you come to me, you will mount up with wings like eagles. You will run and not grow weary. You will walk and not faint, because we are doing it in his strength. His way is the best way. So the points today: a judgmental attitude hinders our relationships. We need to be diligent in our spiritual walk with Jesus, and God will guide and provide for us as we go. A lot of times the Sermon on the Mount, we have just a little bit to finish, can be a lot of we read it as a lot of do's and don'ts. And really what Jesus is saying, you want to have a wonderful life, and you want to have a wonderful work, and you want to have a wonderful, I'll say this again, wonderful life that glorifies your Father, then follow what my guiding and direction is. It may seem narrow, it may seem hard, and I know that it is, because I am walking that myself. We know he walked his path clear to the cross. But in the end, blessings for eternity. You know, there was a scripture, whether it's proven or not, some debate it, in Cyrus's tomb. There was an inscription in there that said, basically the translation came out to this: I am Cyrus the Great, the builder of the Persian Empire, conqueror of the world. Allow me this small piece of earth. That's what he asked for the conqueror, because he knew someday that another king was going to come in. We don't need to worry about that. We have a place in heaven where we will not be forgotten. Cyrus can have his peace on this earth. I'll take mine in heaven, where the treasures and the Lord and everything is there.